to the second part of the talk, which is generally the idea of mean field theory. Let me just quickly check on time. Okay. All right. So just a little question for you. Who of you has already heard of dynamic mean field theory? So then I can maybe jump over the first part of it. I think Moritz Helias gave a talk recently, right?
I was going to say Moritz came and gave the latest and greatest talk a couple of weeks ago.
All right, so that means I will quickly jump over the general mean field theory idea and then really come to this new part, which is basically extension of these ideas of dynamic mean field theory to a non-stationary scenario. All right, general idea of mean field theory is you have a recurrent network and you replace all the input of the different recurrent units by some effective noise term, which is Gaussian. So your initial system of coupled ordinary differential equation boils down to a single ODE, where eta now has Gaussian statistics. So now, depending on the system you're studying, you just have to make sure that the variance is self-consistent. That means if I drive a network with a certain noise, drive a single example neuron with a certain noise term, what does this variance of this noise term have to be such that if I now accumulate this noise term out of these typical units, that I get a self-consistent solution such that the input is basically consistent with the output. And in a case where you have finite autocorrelations, so for example, in a continuous time system, you also have to take care of the autocorrelations. So you need to make the autocorrelations self-consistent. And so what we will do here today is now we have a time-dependent autocorrelation function. And so that's what's new. Just very briefly, starting from a vanilla network without any mean coupling, but with external input, so you can reduce this recurrent interaction term by some effective noise term, and then you can rewrite that term in terms of a partial differential equation, and you multiply this term with a different time constant from the right, and take the expectation with respect to noise and initial conditions. And so that's the CXX, that's the autocorrelation of X. And so remember, the Jij has a variance of G squared over M. And so you end up with a G squared term here. And so this is just sigma as the noise strength. So this is now a partial differential equation, which can be, assuming stationarity, can boil down to a single equation. So stationarity basically now assumes that this system settles into some state which you can push forward in time, so only the time differences matter. And so this is now, so basically what you do to solve this mean field equation is you solve for some C0, some self-consistent variant, and then afterwards, starting from the self-consistent variance, you integrate according to that equation the autocorrelation function. And that was also, just as a side remark, done with non-zero means. So that's basically what you need for ReLU. So in that case, because the coupling matrix is non-zero and your input-output function is not symmetric, now you split up your local variable xi into mu of t plus xi tilde of t. So mu of t is now just the mean of the population, and xi tilde is the difference from the mean. And then you have two mean field equations, one for the local field, or the deviation of the local field x tilde. So now again, we look at one typical unit with some effective noise term, and then a second equation for the mean mu. And so yeah, if we call this mean firing rate nu, then so this new term here, just the expectation over phi of t. And so then you have now to solve two equations self-consistently. So you need to make sure that the variance, the mean, and the autocorrelation are self-consistent. And so again, this has been done before by Katman, Harish Hansel, and Master Giuseppe. but for us, it's a little bit more tricky because now we have a time-dependent mean. If all neurons receive the same external input, we have a time-dependent variance, and we have an autocorrelation function which not only depends on the relative time distance, but on the two total time points. All right, so how do we do that? The first steps are the same. So we have this coupled system of ODEs. We write down the individual local fields, split into some mean term and some deviation term. And now we can write down two mean field equations, one for the mean term with some self-consistent noise, whose autocorrelation and variance we have to determine, and some mean term. But so now the tricky thing is we go further, and note that the mean of the noise is 0, and again, mu is the expectation over the firing rates. So if we go further, just these steps are exactly the same steps as you've seen on the previous slide, and which was done by many people before in mean field theory. We now can't have this assumption of stationarity here. So we have this partial differential equation, which now explicitly depends on t and on s, and there's not really a way around it. And so now, how can we solve that? That was the tricky question, and I was really grateful to have Sven Gödecke, who is expert in mean field theory, who was able to help us with that, and I learned a lot during the last year, basically from him on mean field theory. In the beginning, I would say I was more like his high-level programming language, and in the meantime, I've mastered it myself, and I can do it myself. So the way we start here is the following. We write down this equation for this deviation of the local field. Now s is our time variable. Again, eta s is our self-consistent noise term. We multiply x tilde t from the left-hand side. And so now taking the expectation over this gives us an evolution equation for the correlation. But you now see that there is this weird mixed term between x tilde and eta here showing up. And so how do we deal with that? Well, that's now a new auxiliary field, and we have to also write down an evolution equation for that. How do we do that? Basically exactly the same as I just did, only that we multiply eta s from the right-hand side to x tilde of t. And so that means now we have two evolution equations, one for the autocorrelation in the direction of s, and one for this auxiliary field, let's call it r, in the direction t. And so we can integrate these forward in time. And so these are the two equations which we need to solve. What I put under the rug here is, at the same time, we also have to solve mu, the mean, but that's just a one-dimensional equation, so not so difficult. And yeah, this can be integrated forward in time. And basically, what that means now is you have to solve a lot of Gaussian integrals to evaluate basically these Gaussian functions of ReLU, but that's something which can be done for ReLU, but I mean for ReLU it's particularly simple, but numerically you can also do it for other nonlinearities. So generally this time non-stationary mean field theory works very generically. Yeah, and so we now have two evolutions, two basically, yeah, evolutions. One for this auxiliary field R, C x tilde eta, and then one for C x tilde, and one of them is an evolution in T, and the other one is an evolution in S. So basically, we to write, if you wanted to write down a numerical scheme for that, you would have to integrate it on a grid. And
can I ask a question, Rainer?
Okay.
Yeah, just going back. So just so I'm clear, so you said like so the non-scalar ones are just these coupled two ones. We're always dealing with this mean field variable that we're trying to solve for. So it's always like scalar or just like these pairwise combinations of 2D systems. Okay.
Yeah. So
And then also that the ensemble then is always just over the input, the random input ensemble. Is that right?
I think the ensemble is both over network realizations and over the input.
Okay. Right. Okay.
But thanks for asking for clarification. Yeah, we could also write here now a third equation for the mean, but the mean is integrated also along the t direction. And so the tricky thing is that c x tilde and eta and c x tilde x tilde, they depend on each other. So this one basically has to integrate that noise term here, and this one has to integrate this mixed term here, for which we have an evolution equation here. So it's like a chicken egg problem, but you can solve them at the same time on a grid. You just have to observe causality. So basically, you cannot integrate a value which you don't know yet. And so you start at one corner with some initial condition on a grid, and then you causally move forward and fill subsequently the whole grid of autocorrelations.
How expensive is that? I mean, I guess it's easy because it's depending on the resolution of the grid.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in principle, it would be quadratic in the number of time steps you want to integrate, right? Because it's a two-dimensional grid. But then you actually don't need, I'll show you in a bit, you don't need to simulate the entire grid, because the autocorrelations, they basically fall down to some oscillatory regime. And so you only need to solve the autocorrelation till they've fallen down to the floor. You'll see in a bit.
Okay, thanks.
But thanks so much for asking about mu. That's important to point out. So here you see now the network dynamics for independent input. In the first column, you see a couple of example neurons. So with now no input, they just happily fluctuate chaotically. The firing rates, sorry, these are not the local fields, but the firing rates. Yeah. And for weak input, they are somewhat correlated, but not fully correlated. And then for strong input, they get periodic, and but then they have basically a random phase because each of them receives a different input. So now if you take the mean over the firing rates, it's just flat, and so that's what made the mean field theory for example, for Kanaka-Rajan simple. I mean, they had, or also for Bürike, Zucker, so basically they had time-dependent input, but then on the mean field level, it just averages out, and if you have enough units, the mean rate is flat. And so even if you have strong input, the mean rate is just flat. But now the autocorrelation, that's not flat. So the autocorrelation in the chaotic regime falls off to some finite value for ReLU. And then if you drive it now with external input, it falls off to something called a cyclostationary regime. So basically it falls off, and then it keeps on oscillating. And now for strong input, the whole autocorrelation function is periodic, meaning basically that the system shifted by one period is exactly the same. The dynamics is exactly the same.
And Rainer, the origin of these oscillations is just the intrinsic is intrinsic insofar as it's this like thing where at the edge of chaos you have a pair of eigenvalues of the spectrum.
No. So this is now really an independently driven input where each neuron. Sorry, I should have maybe made that more clear. Each neuron receives a sine wave in the scenario.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so independent, right? Independent sinusoidal rather than independent random.
But this would be exactly the same as what Kanaka-Rajan, Hamsul-Brinsky, and Larry Arrett studied, only that they study 10H networks, and so here we study ReLU networks. But now what's new is this common input, and so for common input, now if you look, well, I mean, the individual units, without input, they are exactly the same. With weak input, they are getting more and more like locked to that external input, and then for strong input, there are these breaks in between where the network is really dead silent, and where you basically where the input is sufficiently strong to strongly negative to completely suppress any activity. And now if you look on the mean firing rate that fluctuates over time in this scenario. So in green you see the simulation, and in dashed you see the theory, and they are on top of each other. Now on the in the rightmost column you see the autocorrelation, and so that's I still have to figure out how to depict that here. Here we basically have this two-dimensional autocorrelation, so I cannot really plot the mean field theory on top of this here, or basically I would have to average over the grid. But you can see that the autocorrelation becomes more and more oscillatory as we crank up the external input. And so just to show you this grid, so here you see the C x tilde in a chaotic regime, so without input, you start at some initial condition, and then you integrate it like forward, or you integrate it on that grid with these two time axes. So you basically can ignore the upper triangular part of that. And here, if you would go anti-diagonally, the autocorrelation would just fall down, like you have in a usual anti-summer chaotic rate network scenario. But now, if we start if we drive it with very strong input, you get this checkerboard pattern. So basically, the autocorrelation is periodic on this checkerboard, and so you start integrating it, you will arrive at this periodic solution of the autocorrelation function pretty quickly. Now, the interesting scenario, or the interesting case, is what happens if you have only weak input, so if it's chaotic, then the solution of the autocorrelation function is periodic, basically along the diagonal, but it falls off along the anti-diagonal. And so this is now the cyclostationary solution, which I showed you earlier. And to answer your question, Max, about time complexity, we don't need to integrate that forever in this direction here, basically along the shoulders of the autocorrelation, but just sufficiently long such that they don't matter anymore. And so effectively, it only scales linear in the number of time steps, because we can choose some time bandwidth, basically, of our autocorrelation function, which we want to integrate. Is that kind of clear?
Yeah. I have a question too here.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a good time to. Well, maybe Max, did you have something to add? Sorry, I didn't want to cut.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I was just wondering. I'm trying to build the intuition of the difficulty here to expand this to arbitrary correlated inputs. And forgive me if that's done, but like, would it then the difficulty be that you would have as many component to this coupled PDE as you would have different inputs? Because right now, like, I'm looking at the CXX and the CX eta, and then am I looking at more of these CX eta i's as I add different inputs? So basically, if I would go...
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So in this, I mean, what we already have implemented is just this interpolation from going between completely independent and completely common input. So in this case, we would have two components, and then we just solve the same mean field theory, only that now we also have to basically solve the independent input case simultaneously with the common input case, which is not a problem. You can just do it the same way. Now, for the scenario you mentioned earlier that you have two different inputs, let's say two Einstein-Uhlenbeck processes with different realization, for that case, you would use a two-population network. And so then you don't have two mean field equations, but you would have four mean field equations.
Oh, yeah, because the okay, but say every... Okay, but in the scenario where I would prescribe a covariance matrix for individual neuron inputs, right? Then you would have as many C's here as there is neurons. Is that correct? Or
I think it depends on the rank of your covariance, but I think it's an interesting question. So something,
right? Yeah.
If we maybe we have some time to discuss that at the end. So we
sure. Yeah. If there's no concise answer, then that's fine. I'm just trying to see if that's the good place to talk about it. But let's talk about it offline. Yeah.
I'm almost done. Just very quickly, I just wanted to tell you how to calculate Lyapunov exponents based on the mean field theory. So what I just described to you is how to calculate the covariance, but then if you want to get Lyapunov exponents from the mean field theory, what you start with is two replica, like say this blue and the red initial network. These are now two copies of the network with same initial conditions and which are driven with the same external input. And so you can write down mean field theory when you now basically say these two mean field typical units receive the same external input, but now we start them with just infinitesimally different initial conditions. And so you can write down an evolution for the distance between the two replica. And now the next step is you write down a temporal evolution equation for the distance between the two replica. You linearize around small perturbations between the two replica. And then the exponential rate of the divergence between the two gives you the Lyapunov exponent. And so in the independent case, you can reduce that to a Schrödinger equation, which has a very nice physical interpretation. But in the other case of this homogeneous input, you solve at the same time as you solve your covariance. You also solve the variational equation. So the variational equation, you can think of it as answering the question, how does an infinitesimal perturbation between two network copies evolve over time, and does it grow or shrink? And so that means you have another field for this distance, and then another auxiliary field, and that works out all well. And so here's the largest Lyapunov exponent for as a function of the input strength for common and independent input. And again, you see that huge difference between common and independent input, and the dots are the numerics, and the dashed line is the theory, and they work rather well. And maybe just to quickly answer Riza's question. Do I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes.
Yes. You asked in the beginning, how do we do the theory here? So basically, we have, based on this mean field theory now, a mean field theory for the largest Lyapunov exponent, but then again you have to do bisectioning, or you have to basically find a critical Lyapunov condition such that the largest Lyapunov exponent is 0, and so this gives you then the I1 critical as a function, for example, of G, or as a function of F. So in the numerics, for each network realization, we do this bisectioning scheme, and so we get a bunch of different critical values for a given network realization, for a given network size, and for a given set of parameters. And here for the mean field theory, there is no network realization, but we still do a root finding procedure to find the critical value. In some cases, you can also, I think for Gaussian white noise independent input, you can analytically directly calculate a criterion for when the largest Lyapunov exponent becomes 0, but generically you can't do that. And the other question, which was also asked in the beginning, I think by Mata, so how well does this mean field theory work? Here you see now in a different scaling. So here I didn't use the balanced scaling, but I basically just do the mean coupling of order 1 over n, such that basically the spectral radius, there is no change of any criticality with network size. And so in this case, you can see that now as we crank up our network size, we go closer and closer to this mean field description of the critical input strength. But there is quite some variability, for small networks. If you only have a network of 100 units or 200 units, then first of all, many of them have a smaller critical input strength, and also there's a huge zoo of fluctuations depending on your network realization. And so finally, if you want to learn more about self-organization, right now the graduate workers at Columbia are on strike, and I just want to declare my solidarity. And given that I'm at a AI institute giving a talk, maybe I should say also solidarity with the tech workers who are unionizing right now. I think doing independent arbitration is a reasonable demand. And with that, I come to the conclusion. Firstly, input correlations impede suppression of chaos in learning and balanced firing rate networks. That's explained by dynamic cancellation of common external input by recurrent currents. And so that might not be a huge surprise for people who are familiar with the balanced state theory, but I think for other people it's still worth pointing out. So the critical input modulation scales as square root n for correlated input, but it is independent of n for independent input. And so the adiabatic theory explains the different scaling, but the full picture only comes from this time-dependent mean field theory, so that gives us the G dependence, F dependence. Yeah, now I would be really curious to hear from you. What do you think should be next? And yeah, maybe to thank all my collaborators, Alessandro and Grosso, who actually started this project, Ramin, Sven Gödecke, but then also the rest of the people at the Theory Center, especially Laureline, Agostina, and also external people who gave me advice on that project. And yeah, so with that, I'd be curious to hear your questions. Thanks so much for joining.
Very nice. I have a quick question, Rainer, if nobody else wants to. So I'm still a bit puzzled as how you can get an estimate of the largest Lyapunov exponent with mean field, right? Because like, I know you just like glanced over it, but my understanding is, you wash a lot of these microscopic input in the mean field approach. And we all know that, averaging these Lyapunov exponents depend on these trajectories and on these microscopic interactions. And so in your replica approach, right, like, do you have independent realization? Like, how does that work so that you can track microscopic changes of these evolutions in a mean field setting? I don't get it.
Yeah. Maybe I was a bit too fast. Probably I should just write down the different steps. So, I mean, let's assume you have the autocorrelation functions and you have like a mean field theory for the individual network, all right? So you have the,
Are you doing it
basically you can
autocorrelation function?
No. So
okay.
You have an autocorrelation function of the individual neuron, let's say of one typical neuron. Let's call it like X1, the typical unit of the upper network. And now you can make just a copy of the entire network, and you have a replica. And now both of them are driven by exactly the same noise realization. But you start them with different initial conditions. So the fact that you start them with initial different conditions will now give you one force which basically pulls these two networks, the blue one and the green, the blue one and the red one apart, which is this recurrent interaction term, right? I mean, that's what you probably intuitively would agree with in a spiking network. Or like Max could also probably explain that in a spiking network, how if you have one spike crossing event, you have this strong decorrelation effect through the recurrent currents. But at the same time, you have this correlating input from the external input, from this common input. And so these two forces are now competing with each other. On the one hand, you're being pulled apart by your recurrent currents, which are independent or different for the two replica. And you have the same external input, which is common. And now the question is, like, who of the two wins? And to answer that question, you have to write down not only an autocorrelation function, which basically describes the dynamics of these etas here, but you have to write down a cross-correlation function. So because we want to know how correlated is the x1 and x2. And
that's right.
And now once you have a cross-correlation function, you can express the distance between the two as a function of the autocorrelation and the cross-correlation functions. I mean, if you just think like you have, and so once
you're still approximating the microscopic interactions through the usual mean field approach, right? Like your black arrow here, going from the hexagon to this is still kind of an expansion in some noise model.
Totally a mean field theory, and you can see here it only works for large networks.
That's right, but that particular arrow, you're tracking the expansion of that particular. It's not based on realization, but it's you're tracking the difference in the mean expansion, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And is there a reason why? Can you do the whole spectrum that way, or can you just do the top?
No, I mean there's another, like for discrete time networks, we can calculate the full Lyapunov spectrum even in the case with external input, and that actually is interesting for machine learning. And probably I should like
we need to talk about that. Yeah.
But yeah, and that's interesting because then you get information about the whole tangent space structure.
Totally.
But so this mean field approach, at least in my understanding, only works for the largest Lyapunov exponent.
Yeah, that's what my intuition is the same. By the way, I'm gonna do a shameless plug here. If some of you in the dynamical systems reading group are interested in learning how to numerically compute Lyapunov exponents, this is what I'm be covering next week in the dynamical systems class. I'm gonna post a Zoom link. If anybody's welcome to join, but these are important tools to understand if you guys are interested. So end of the plug here.
Speaking of shameless plugs, I can also plug my preprint here in the chat. So that's basically for firing rate networks, a preprint where we calculated carefully like full Lyapunov spectrum, both with discrete time, continuous time, different nonlinearities, and also with external input. Yeah, Marta, yet another question?
Yes, sorry if it's naive.
No, go ahead.
I'm hearing your feedback. It's probably
I'm sorry.
On my side.
Is it better now?
Yes, it's better now. No, it's not. That's okay. I'll just ask my question anyway. So my question is, how is the autocorrelation what you decide the plasticity on? Like, I am wondering what is how do you discuss about capabilities for plasticity based on your findings? Probably autocorrelation.
I'm not entirely sure. You're asking, like, could we do a mean field theory if we add plasticity to the network, or are you asking what does this mean field theory tell us about learning? Because that was basically part of the story before.
I'm saying I can see like how you decide what are the stable trajectories for the learning, but you also discuss about plasticity in the abstract. So I was wondering how is that connected to plasticity?
Yeah, so that was basically that's how the whole thing started. Like Alessandro and Grosso wanted to extend this force and full force to more biologically plausible networks, and so he trained networks in a balanced state with like ReLU units to perform a simple superposition of sine waves, and so he found that it's really hard to train them, and he needed now after you understand like why it's so hard to suppress chaos, you can obviously easily think of remedies. Like one way is have input weights of mean zero or have uncorrelated input. But so initially he found that it's just almost impossible to train these networks, and so this basically explains it. So when you have common external input in a balanced state, that's just being dynamically cancelled, and therefore you need much stronger input to suppress chaos, and therefore much stronger input to train a network to do something.
Okay, so it's the notion of common or independent input. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, pushing this to sort of like into this sort of learning realm, what struck me about how you describe it in the abstract is that, if you're trying to learn some complex deterministic signal, maybe just adding in a bit of uncorrelated noise might help. And I know that maybe that's a conjecture that you made, but I'm just trying to think, because I'm trying to understand how the relative magnitudes of the two, like what that statement about improved learning with added noise would require of the relative magnitudes between the thing that you want to learn that you're driving the network with and this sort of additional noise that you might decide to to throw in to sort of try to leverage some of these properties?
No, I think it's a great question related to Guillaume's question about like what happens if you interpolate between the two. I should say that when I say independent input, I usually talk about independent signal here and not noise. So I think it's a really interesting question, like how does noise shape trainability? And there's also a link between generalization and noise and Lyapunov exponents, which goes a little bit beyond this project. But I think based on what we've shown here, what you could say is that it's good to have some independent input such that like some component which can't be cancelled in order to train a network, which is in the balanced state again. I mean, I should say this is a very limited statement here about networks which are deeply in a balanced state. But so the theory is more general. It's not only a theory for balanced networks, but it's more general for arbitrary networks which receive correlated external input. And so I don't know how familiar you're to NTK, but so in principle, you could now use such a theory for doing NTK for correlated input. Or more general, like, yeah, doing a mean field theory for recurrent network, also discrete time networks.
But when you say that it would help to add some uncorrelated input, what's the relative size between that and the signal that you actually wanted to learn? Is there a prescription that your theory gives for that relative magnitude? Sounds like it would.
So for the critical input strength scales square root n for correlated input, and so you only need order 1 independent input. You only need to add order 1 independent input in order to suppress chaos. So if you only like, let's say you have a scenario where you drive it with some input and you make that very strong and you succeed to suppress chaos, or you want to suppress, let's say you want to suppress chaos, order 1 independent input is enough to suppress chaos. That would be my response. Does it kind of make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
More questions? That's really fun. I'm really happy
that you asked. That was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we should have you once again to talk about the Lyapunov exponents in RNNs. You know, Max and I and other colleagues have also results on that front, so we should do kind of a Lyapunov spectra of artificial networks.
I'd be totally up. I would be totally up for that. That sounds interesting.
All right.
Yeah, and if you have further ideas like where this project could go next, I mean, I could just vaguely say some things. So one direction is something Guillaume also asked, like what happens if you have low rank input? So if it's not either independent or common, but let's say you have rank 3 input noise, how to extend that to that? Or another thing would be multi-population networks. Then one thing is based on that, you could develop a theory of force. You could develop a theory of mutual information between, assuming a Gaussian channel approximation, between some external input source and some mean population rate. And I think, usually when people talk about information theory, it's always a bit tricky in large neural systems, but based on this Gaussian channel approximation, you could actually make it precise. But yeah, I'd be really curious if you have further ideas where to bring this theory, or if you have any problems where you think that might be an interesting approach.
This is probably a long way off, but I mean, in principle, this would be the theory that you would need for sort of, episodic sort of experience, like neural activity for episodic experiences, where you have some, you're having an animal do a task many, many times, and you're recording from some area that for which you have some understanding of the inputs, which is probably unlikely, or somehow you sort of have some handle on what's driving it. And this would be the mean theory that you would need to describe that network activity under this sort of non-stationary but finite window period, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. Like scenarios where you actually deal with non-stationary inputs would be really interesting here. So, for example, also, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar to the recent work by Agostina Parmigiano. She asked like, how would populations of neurons of different inhibitory subtype respond to external input? And she extended basically this framework of Kaplan-Topolinsky to a multi-population framework of fixed points. But now, of course, you might ask, like, if we have optogenetic perturbations, we might want to understand the response to temporal varying input. And so I think potentially this might be a road forward there. And so I had a couple of interesting exchanges with Agostina Parmigiano on that. And yeah, something else might.
Sorry, I was gonna say, what about connectivity structure? Like like remember the mean field paper from Merav Stern and Jonathan, right? Like where they had some sort of connectivity profiles or even sparsity in networks, right? Do you think you can adapt this? It seems flexible enough to deal with different connectivity structures, right?
Yeah, certainly. Multi-population networks would be one possible extension. Something which like one student is playing around with right now, but it's currently not on a mean field level, but more on a numerical level. He's going from symmetric to anti-symmetric networks and exploring different dynamic regimes and trainability. And the problem if you add motifs to your network is just that, yeah, these mean field approaches get very difficult because usually, or like in general at least, things are not Gaussian anymore then.
Mm.
And so for example, by having a symmetric connectivity, you introduce an effective self-coupling term. And that makes it tricky. There's also a mean field theory to tackling that, but yeah, that is a bit different than this approaching. But it would be a way. There would be a way.
Cool. Right. I need to go, unfortunately, but Reiner, that was awesome. Let's
thank
keep
you.
in touch. Yeah. And
thanks so much for having me. And I'd be really curious to talk more about machine learning applications of these kinds of ideas, maybe in 2-3 months once we are done with them.
Yeah. Well, we'll be in touch soon, Reiner. Yeah.
Cool. Yes. And see you on Thursday. And thank you all again for joining.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah. See
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Reiner.
Bye, Reiner.
Bye-bye. I quickly want to see what people wrote in the chat.